So the General Conference for the United Methodist Church wrapped up last week after two very action-packed weeks that I had the joy of covering, and a lot of you were with me. I knew that I needed to do a series of interviews on the back end with people who were there, people who knew what was going on behind the scenes, so that I would know how to process what happened, but also so that you guys would know kind of how to move forward and how to understand what transpired. So today I'm going to be joined by Reverend Tom Lambrecht, who many of you will know his name. He's the VP and General Manager of Good News. If you've been signed up to Good News, he's been writing a ton of the articles for the last couple of years, always very insightful, very mature, very to the point. I've personally benefited and professionally from Tom so much over the last few years. He's served as a United Methodist elder in Wisconsin since 1982, after a brief career as a music teacher. He's a graduate of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and he has served various sized congregations and fulfilled leadership roles on many different councils, boards, committees, and task forces within the Wisconsin Annual Conference. So since 1992, Tom has worked with Good News as part of their legislative team at 9 general conferences and as a member of their board. Tom served as the chair of the Good News Board for 4 years and is currently the coordinator for the Renewal and Reform Coalition in the General Conference effort. He left pastoral ministry in 2011 to serve full-time with Good News as vice president and general manager. Tom has been instrumental in the cause of evangelical renewal within the Wisconsin Conference since 1983, helping to establish the Wisconsin Association of Confessing United Methodists in 1996 and serving as their first president. So if you can't tell, I've been excited to talk to Tom. This is our first time to ever talk today. I've sent him annoying text messages, and he's always been kind to respond. But this is our first time to really talk face-to-face, so to speak, through a screen. And at this time, I'd like to bring him on screen. And Tom, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. How are you today?
I'm great, Jeffrey. Thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation.
I think it'll be to my benefit, but also to the benefit of anyone who decides to spend time with us. My intention in doing this is that everybody can kind of understand what the score is, where they stand, how it is that they want to move forward, whether they're inside or outside of the United Methodist Church. I just think we need an informed perspective rather than just a reactionary perspective, and I know you can offer that. A lot of people don't know what transpired, or they only know like what the news has reported. How would you summarize, for those who care about the Methodists, have a sympathetic view of the Methodists, what happened in Charlotte over the last couple of weeks that is important to take away?
Well, Jeffrey, I think the most important takeaway is the realization that the United Methodist Church is not the same church it was 2 weeks ago. It is a new denomination with a new understanding of Scripture and moral teaching, and it has dramatically altered its course of direction that I think people are going to want to know about. That's indicated by the actions that were taken to lift all of the language about sexuality and marriage and change a lot of the language about that in our Book of Discipline in a much more progressive direction. But that progressive direction was manifested in other ways as well, and I think will be manifested in the future in a lot of different ways as well. I think the headline news is that same-sex marriage is now legal in the United Methodist Church. Pastors are not required to perform same-sex weddings, but they're allowed to. And at the same time, the ordination of partnered gay and lesbian clergy is now legal. Consecration of gay bishops is now legal. Basically, all the restrictions that were on LGBT persons have been lifted. It's mandated that sexual orientation is now, alongside race and gender, one of the things that cannot be considered when a pastor is appointed to a local church. Pastor parish committees are going to be trained in how to receive persons of LGBTQ identity. And LGBTQ persons are to be nominated to all of our general boards and agencies and included in every aspect of the life of our church. So it's a pretty sweeping set of changes that took place in that regard, and it indicates a different direction that our church is taking.
Yeah, so there were. I need to get clear on the implications of some of the stuff related to sexual orientation and gender identity, because depending on who you're listening to, it's either not a big deal or it is a big deal. One of the things that the talking heads are disagreeing about is whether or not local churches are going to be compelled to receive clergy that have a lifestyle, the sexual orientation, sexual behavior that they are not happy with. There are a lot of bishops saying, no, 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 we're not going to force you to receive anybody you want to. But for someone like me, I'm looking at, okay, so a lot of congregations were forced to accept clergy along the way that they didn't want to for race or sex reasons, and that might be justified, but you mean to say you're not going to cram gay clergy down their throat when you've already crammed a lot of other clergy down their throat that they weren't necessarily fond of? But then secondly, there does seem to be some explicit language adopted saying your church needs to prepare to receive gay clergy. You need to equip yourselves. So, there's this charge of fear-mongering. Are we fear-mongering if we say, hey, if you're United Methodist, somewhere down the line, they can and might force you to receive gay clergy, even if you don't want to? How fair is it to make that point? How do you do that reasoning around that?
Well, I think in the short term, the bishops are determined not to create waves in their local churches, and so they are wanting to appoint people that will be acceptable to the local church. I think there, as some of the bishops have said in their communication, there is not a great supply of gay clergy looking for a church, and there are a number of churches in the every annual conference who are very open to having a gay clergy person. So they expect the supply and demand for gay clergy to match out pretty well in the short term. What I'm concerned about in the longer term is that if sexual orientation is the same order of concern as race and gender, then it's going to be a problem for local churches that have a principled opposition to that. Just like it's a problem for churches that have a principled opposition for women clergy, which I support women clergy, but in the past, churches have been educated into wanting to receive a female pastor, and that's part of what it means to be United Methodist, that you receive a female pastor if one's appointed to you. And it could eventually come to that same situation with gay clergy as well.
All right, so what I think I just heard you say is in the short term, they're not going to start shoving things down any church's throats, but in the long term, there is going to be a culture shift that impacts everywhere across the denomination. So that was one thing pertaining to sexual orientation and gender identity that people have been arguing about. The other thing is that in the chargeable offenses among clergy, not only did they take out the part dealing with homosexuality, but they also dealt with celibacy and singleness and faithfulness and marriage portion. They took that out. The way I remember it being reasoned on the floor was this is language that has been historically used to marginalize sexual minorities, which sounds patently ridiculous to me. I've heard them arguing on the other side of this that, hey, the term sexual or immorality, or maybe just immorality, still exists, and we will still hold clergy accountable to sexual morality. But to people like me, when you take that out of there, all of a sudden you can no longer remove clergy that are sleeping around when they're single, nor can you remove clergy who are cheating on their wife or their husband if they're female clergy, or I guess gay clergy. To me, that just seems to signal a complete antinomian, sexually licentious culture in the clergy, which I would just think is nuts. But how much am I being hyperbolic, and then how much is that real, Tom?
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, because normally when you have a church law that you want to charge somebody based on, you need to have a clear definition of what that means. Mm-hmm. So if you have a church law that says you can't commit immorality, well, what is immorality? That standard is changing. It's changing in our society. It's changed quite a bit over the last 20, 30 years. And so, what standard do we define immorality as being?
Hmm.
There's no clear definition. And when the church changed its definition of marriage and its teaching on sexuality in the social principles, that was our definition of immorality. And it was then put into the chargeable offenses with the fidelity in marriage and celibacy and singleness language. But it was first in the social principles. And what the social principles now say is that marriage is between two persons of faith, could be a man and a woman, or it could be two persons of the same gender. And there's no expectation that the sexual relationship is to be reserved for marriage. All that is required is that there be consent, monogamy, whatever that means, and respect, and those are the kind of the definitions of immorality that would have to be operated on. So I think it would be very difficult to hold a clergy person to the standard of not violating immorality when there's not a clear definition of it. And I think that any church trial lawyer worthy of their salt would pounce upon that as in the course of a trial and say there's no definition of immorality. You can't just import your own definition, and so I think there's going to be very difficult to hold clergy accountable to the kind of sexual standards that we've had in the past.
Yeah. Some of the people that I've seen comment on it imagine that each annual conference would come up with their own sexual misconduct policy that they would use as grounds of exercising that. How realistic does that seem versus just kind of having a Wild West, who knows?
Well, it's certainly possible that an annual conference could do that. I'm not sure that an annual conference has the authority to do that
Right.
under church law.
Hmm.
It's the general conference that defines church law, and the annual conference. I don't know that's a workable solution. It's interesting that in the course of the whole regionalization proposal that I'm sure we'll talk about, the adjustment was made so that jurisdictions could now adapt the Book of Discipline.
Hmm.
So maybe a jurisdiction will adopt a standard of immorality. Maybe a regional conference, maybe the U.S. Regional Conference will adopt its own standard. But that's all in the future somewhere, and that's hypothetical. At the moment, we have no clear standard for sexual immorality in our church.
Yeah. And when you say in our church, you are still United Methodist. I'm not, but you're speaking on behalf of a collective entity now where even as you're talking about, hey, we might have different sexual standards in different regions, that sounds so crazy to someone like me who's read their Bible and knows that God's law applies equally across the whole body of the church. Sexual licentiousness is not acceptable in one member of the body and not another. So that seems patently ridiculous to me. But regionalization as a whole, yeah, let's go ahead and pivot to that. Regionalization as a whole seemed fundamentally silly to me. It seemed on its face to be designed only to grant Westerners the desire that they had to behave sexually however they wanted. And what was really appalling to me was to see how many non-Americans they were able to get on board with this. Talked with Rob Renfro in our portion yesterday about how it was that the African delegation got so compromised. The Filipino delegation, similarly, the culture there is hostile to Western sexual theory, but they were somehow able to cull their representatives to give them over to themselves, essentially. So, what's to be said about the regionalization effort at this point? They succeeded, obviously. There's ratification next year. We could talk about the odds of that passing, but maybe it'd be better just to have you start with the basic. What are the implications of what was just passed?
Well, the implications are that there is going to be regionalization in the governance structure of the church. Even if the constitutional amendments don't pass, they did form a regional standing committee of U.S. affairs that equivalent to the standing committee on Central Conference matters, and it consists of all the U.S. delegates. So U.S. delegates will be able to meet prior to the next general conference and enact whatever they want regarding the U.S. The thing of it is, it still needs to be approved by the general conference until those constitutional amendments are ratified. And if that were to happen, if the amendments are ratified, then there will be a separate entity called the U.S. Regional Conference, and they won't need general conference approval then for the various things that they do. So it sets up this situation where there are important issues like clergy standards, definition of marriage, those kinds of bedrock matters that are going to differ between one region and another. It sets up an incoherent situation in the church, I believe, where you end up having different beliefs and different teachings in different regions, and that to me is an unraveling of our connectional system. I perfectly understand the need to have different worship styles, different legal kind of structures in different countries based on secular law and things like that. That makes a lot of sense to me. But when you start talking about fundamental beliefs and teachings and doctrines of the church, as well as practices like requirements for clergy, then you're really getting at things that are supposed to hold us together as a denomination, and not and being able to do them differently in different regions means we're no longer a connectional church.
Yeah, it's so strange to me that people argue seriously that it is still a connectional church. They do share the fundamental doctrinal pieces and the same constitution, but the thing is, they've been ignoring that language for a long time, so that doesn't really seem to matter very much. The things that are just blatantly problematic, I don't know how it is that they can take themselves seriously, but they didn't dismantle the jurisdictional system, so you still have an additional layer of church governance for the Americans. You still have this prioritization of American bishops over non-American bishops by guaranteeing that each jurisdiction has 5 bishops. The first week, they're openly saying it is a racist system that we need to address later on. Second week, they're defending it in order to maintain as many bishops as they can, despite the fact that they're dying. But then also, bishops in the United Methodist Church are still considered bishops of the whole church. So there are currently 2 gay bishops. There's probably going to be more in the future. And hypothetically, they could be assigned to non-American central conferences, annual conferences, regionals. I don't know exactly, but I know that these bishops that the whole church is paying for are still bishops of the whole church. So this separation that has been sold is not how it is. And on top of that, you still don't have equal representation in the boards and agencies. And as you just pointed out, you just have an American-only standing committee that was just established, and that all these things imply they're speaking out of one side of their mouth saying it's a global church, everybody should have the same rights, and out of the other side of their mouth, Americans are going to be first among equals. We're going to have all, the among equals takes a back seat to we're going to be first, really. So is it as patently ridiculous as it seems to me, or do you think that there are... Well, so you said it makes complete sense to imagine there needs to be some differences from region to region for obvious reasons. Did regionalization need to happen in order for those things to take place, really?
No, because the general church, the discipline, doesn't regulate many of those things. And so there was already the freedom to adapt the discipline to fit local laws. So regionalization really was not for the sake of the central conferences. Regionalization was for the sake of the U.S. The argument that it creates an equal playing field was that that all the regions needed the same ability to adapt the discipline. In the past, the U.S. has been the majority, and so the U.S. has been able to control where the discipline landed on things.
Mm-hmm.
In the future, if things stay the way they are right now, the African delegation will eventually be the majority, and the U.S. will be the minority. And I think they really saw that, and some of them think that that's going to happen as soon as 2026 or 2028. And they simply are not willing to live under an African majority
Mm-hmm.
because there's such a difference in understanding of things like sexual morality.
Mm-hmm.
And so they decided that they needed to free themselves from being under that voice and controlled by the African majority. So they put in the regionalization plan as a way to allow the U.S. to do its own thing.
Yeah. And that's just seemed openly like xenophobic, if not racist to me. I just couldn't believe that these people that, I mean, the leadership promoting this talk about anti-racism and solving racism in the future while simultaneously perpetuating a segregated racial ethnic divide, So I don't know how I don't know how they maintain this image that they've got. Regionalization still has to be ratified next year, and all the annual conferences, 2/3 of all the combined delegates have to vote in favor of it. Part of me has been in favor of Africans holding on and shooting the whole thing down, and then they have to go back to square one, and Africans can take over the denomination. But lately I've been thinking, why would the liberal leadership in the American church honor that system? It seems to me that they'll at that point just say, nope, we're not going to give you the reins of control. We're just not going to do it. And at that point, there's going to be no recourse. So part of me has wanted to advocate that my African friends stay with the system and use it against the people who've declared themselves enemies. But then part of me is thinking it's all futile because these people have already made it very clear that they're not going to play by the rules whenever it doesn't suit them.
If they didn't agree to abide by the decisions of the 2019 General Conference, what makes you so sure that they're going to agree to abide by rules in the future? It's like you say.
Okay. All right. I was thinking I might be overly cynical, but if I am, then you're there with me. So yeah.
Well, and the fact that they've already set up a U.S. standing committee that really is going to have a lot of weight and power. Certainly that committee is going to be able to block things that they don't like.
Right.
And so I think that it's really set up, whether the ratification happens or not, it's set up that the U.S. is going to stay in control of its own matters.
Let's briefly, well, we don't have to be brief. There were a number of other things that were passed at General Conference that are not around sexuality, but they did signal a leftist overtaking of the denomination. Can you speak to any of that stuff?
Well, we didn't. Our coalition did not track a lot of other things, just because we were not. Our agenda at the General Conference was to try to provide for a disaffiliation pathway for churches that didn't have it, both in the U.S., where they've been stymied by annual conferences imposing high fees, as well as mainly outside the U.S., where they never had a chance to consider disaffiliation. So that was really our primary agenda, and we realized that that we did not have the votes to control the outcome of the conference, and because many of us are moving in the direction of the GMC, we did not feel it was right for us to try and determine the future of the UMC. So in past years, we've tracked hundreds and hundreds of pieces of legislation and weighed in on all kinds of different issues. And this time around, we didn't do that. We just focused on those few issues like regionalization and disaffiliation that were important to us, and basically let the conference do what it wanted to do. I think you saw signs of that progressive direction in the worship services that took place, and the kinds of elements that were brought into the worship services. like Native American spirituality and things like that. You saw them working on an anti-Israel kind of platform. You saw mobilization around getting rid of fossil fuel investments. Now that did not pass, but it got a lot of publicity and got a lot of interest. So that's something that may develop in the future.
Hmm.
But so I think that the tendency of the General Conference under a more progressive direction is going to be to see the role of the church as almost a political entity and to advocate for political positions that are probably more liberal, and that's the work of the church, is to do that, to take these stands and pass these resolutions and do divestment of various things, and so that's, to me, that's not what church is about, but that's, I think, what the General Conference is going to become focused on in the future.
So if someone, I am kind of drawn to the hyperbole. If I were to say that the United Methodist Church has now positioned itself to become a wing, a reflection of the leftmost wing of the Democrat Party, a religious action arm of the Democrat Party, how fair a statement do you think that would be?
I think that's pretty fair. Not obviously not in all things, but for a substantial number of agenda items, they will take a very much more liberal stance than many of our members would take.
Hmm.
So I think that's fair to say that the thrust of the political positions that the General Conference will take is going to be much more progressive.
So I don't know if you know this, but I covered probably 95% of the plenary sessions on a live stream that I commented over. One of the number one things that confused people was all this legislation would get passed and it wasn't even talked on the floor of plenary because it was submitted in consent calendars. And so I wondered, you've been to 9 general conferences now. Have consent calendars always been used in that way, or was it exceptionally utilized this last time?
Well, two things. First, I would say consent calendars have always been used like this.
Okay.
But the second thing I'd say is that this General Conference had such an overwhelming majority of progressive leaning delegates that it didn't even make sense to try and fight any of these things. In the past, we have been able to pull things off of the consent calendar and get them voted on by the plenary session,
Hmm.
where there was a more fair and balanced situation. Sometimes the legislative committees get overloaded with one perspective or another. And so it might come out of a legislative committee with very little opposition, but yet when it comes to the plenary floor, it would be voted in a different direction in the past. But now, with the dramatic majority being held by the progressives and centrists, who have a fairly uniform understanding of social issues, these things really, it didn't make sense to try and even fight them. So that's why a lot of things that were important that probably in the past would have been debated on the plenary floor were passed on consent calendar. We did, have a couple of petitions related to sexuality and regionalization that were debated on the plenary floor, and those were kind of like the lighthouse petitions that at least got the debate before people so they could understand what was being done. But even in those cases, the votes were more than 70% in favor. So it was not a case where it was even a close call. So it's a different general conference. The atmosphere was different. The people were remarking about the unity of the general conference and that kind of thing, and the cooperation of everybody working together. And that's because there's pretty much groupthink there.
Hmm.
A lot of the people that would normally have opposed the directions that the church took are no longer there. they've gone to the GMC or they've gone independent. And so those delegates were not present. And so there was a great amount of unity because of the absence of conservative voices.
Well, it seemed to me the last day or two, finally, so throughout the conference, there were African voices that got up and were, in many cases, shut down quite disrespectfully. But the last couple days, I noticed a couple African delegates getting up and in their speech conveying that they didn't even understand what had already been passed. There were a number of things that passed on consent calendar that revised the theology around sexual orientation and gender identity, that it was like they didn't even know had already passed. And they're arguing about something that was voted through quite easily 4 days before. And so I was puzzled because I was thinking maybe the Africans would come, and not just Africans, but whatever conservatives were left. There was, the first time it came up on the floor of plenary, there was a Filipino woman who got up and then an Anglo woman who got up, and they said, here's what the Bible says, and I can't pretend that it doesn't. But it almost seemed to me like the Africans decided to give the Americans over to themselves and not even oppose them. But then on the last couple of days, it was like, wait, what are you guys doing? What are you saying? And so what I had assumed until that point was that the African delegation knew that there was a mass formation psychosis on the part of Americans that there was no point standing in the way of, and they weren't going to try. But then on the last couple of days, it seemed to me that they just hadn't even understood what was going on until that point. And then they were just trying to understand navigating this crazy place that they'd been in. Were both things true, or did you get a sense for, did the Africans even understand what was coming on the consent calendar and what was being voted through, or were they just trying to keep their heads above water this whole time?
Well, I think that it's always a challenge for Africans in particular, and perhaps Filipinos too, I'm not sure, to understand the process of General Conference and what the implications are of different things. And that's one of the roles that we have played in the past and this time as well, helping people understand, okay, this is passing and this is the implication of such a thing. But so I think that there's a lack of understanding sometimes, or a lack of awareness of how things, really happen. Mm-hmm. But I also think that they were reserving their opposition to things that really mattered to them, that were coming up for a plenary debate. And if we had tried to mobilize African support, we could have pulled all of the sexuality things off of the consent calendar. We could have, pulled all the regionalization things off the consent calendar. But the point is, why do we want to fight that? Because we know the direction that things are going. We know that we don't have the votes to stop it. And so it would just be an act of obstructionism to do that. So,
and I think it needs to be appreciated by people that you could have chosen a path of obstructionism. I remember when Mark Holland got on the floor of the 2019 General Conference and said, he had a big stack of things. Here's all the amendments. We're going to gum this thing up until the monster trucks come rolling in. And that's the strategy that the other side used. And that's something that you guys said, we don't want to do that. We just want to provide a way out for those who want out. And
exactly.
That is a noble thing. It also would be noble if they said, no, we're not going to give them over to themselves and we're going to fight them tooth and nail. But that's not the strategy that was used. The strategy was just give us disaffiliation. And then the answer from the General Conference was no. And so I wanted to spend the rest of our time today talking, in Africa, it's one thing. Disaffiliation is not an option unless they do it collectively under paragraph 572, a very prolonged and arduous process. So they never had a disaffiliation akin to Americans, where individual congregations could have a limited right to exit. And now there are a lot of American congregations. I've seen that Bishop Beard and his conference and then the Holston Annual Conference have said, hey, we made promises that after this General Conference there'd be a way out. We're going to maintain these promises. Remains to be seen in some, that promise was made in many other annual conferences. Some of them will probably sustain them. Some of them might not. So there are a lot of anxious Americans as well who are going, okay, we waited. We are not on board with this. We need out. So let's have you minister first. Let's show priority to the Africans who are trying to navigate this situation, assuming there are any who watch us, because they might not. But what guidance, encouragement would you offer them? And then let's turn to the American churches that are feeling anxious right now.
Well, because of the way things have gone, the Africans are really forced to fall back upon their own country's laws of how they can interact with a global nonprofit. So it's my understanding that in some countries of Africa, an annual conference could vote to withdraw from the UMC under its own country's laws, totally apart from anything in the Book of Discipline, and that would be successful. There may be some legal challenges to that. It depends whether the General Council on Finance and Administration decides that they want to fight for property and assets in Africa, or if they want to just allow the Africans to make their own decision. I think it'd be difficult for GCFA to challenge in an African court the various actions that are taking place. Where you might have challenges is where there's a split in the church, where there's a significant minority that doesn't want to disaffiliate from the UMC. They may try to take the majority to court and try to prevent them from disaffiliating. So each country is different in Africa. We kind of lump together the African continent as one unity, and it's not. Every country is different, has its own laws, has its own procedures and processes. And so it's going to be, I think, a messy process in Africa. It's going to be piecemeal. Everybody's not going to act the same or take the same decision. Everybody's not going to take the same strategy or the same route. But I think there is a hopeful possibility that African churches that do want to disaffiliate can do so in some way or another. Again, it's going to be a lot more messy than if we had passed a clean disaffiliation pathway for them. Mm-hmm. But I think that there's a way for that to happen.
That's encouraging. Okay, so all is not lost. They don't need to worry too much. They just need to explore the different legal and logistical options available to them. Just briefly, do you think that there are any annual conferences in Africa that are going to seriously entertain using paragraph 572, or do you think that that's just a non-option?
I think for them it's a non-option because of the time frame. Mm-hmm. It would require them to remain United Methodist for 3-4 years or more, mm-hmm. Until they can work through the process. And what I'm hearing in a lot of cases is that as of right now, they're not willing to stay because of the conflict between the church's position and their own theological position, as well as the legal position in their countries, where many of the countries in Africa, the practice of homosexuality is illegal. And so what I'm hearing in a number of cases is that the church, the United Methodist Church's denominational position is in conflict with the country's laws, mm-hmm. and that gives them the need really to disaffiliate so that they can distinguish themselves and saying, we don't believe this, we're not going to mm-hmm. practice this.
Yeah. So we've thus far covered a lot of territory. We haven't said anything really that Rob and I talked about yesterday, but for those who are wanting to hear more about the African delegation at General Conference or a lot of the developments that took place in Charlotte, if you haven't already seen my conversation with Rob, just go back. Also, if there are additional questions around some of these topics that we've covered, if it has to do with, we're about to minister to American churches. So Scott Field of the WCA is the primary one still trying to help congregations figure out where they need to go. And I'm going to have him on Monday. I should be airing that on Tuesday of this next week. But also, Tom, what are some good resources for people who want to know more about the particulars of what happened at General Conference or any of the stuff that we've covered so far? Where would you point people if they want to know more?
Well, certainly, both the WCA and Good News have posted articles about General Conference. I've done several articles that give you a survey of what took place. Um, that'll be coming in our magazine as well as being posted on our website. So I would start there. News Service has many articles that describe what happened, and they're fairly objective. And so I would recommend that people look at that. Um, there are various summaries that have been put out by different people. I know Chris Ritter has put out a summary of actions that were taken at the General Conference. So there are many of those out there. I think that if people are really dedicated in wanting to know, they could go to the General Conference website and they could watch the live stream recording. They could see what took place. They could watch the debate. They could also track the various petitions that were submitted on particular issues and see what amendments were made and what the votes were to pass or defeat different things. So you can get as far down in the weeds as you want. But I think there are some good summaries out there that people can turn to.
Yeah, the internet's an amazing resource, and it's really a tragedy that Methodists haven't used it as well as we could. I think there's still so many that are just genuinely surprised at what's happened. They feel like it snuck up on them. There was no way to see it coming. And you and I, in our different formats, have been blaring the warning. Hey, look out, it's coming. And the institution called us fearmongers, but we were right. So, what's to be said about the American congregations that are now anxious? They're not sure what to do. According to Tom Lambrecht, what's the wise way forward? What questions should they be asking? What actions should they be entertaining? What do you think?
Well, I think first of all, for those churches that have not had the discussion within their congregation about where they stand on these issues, it's important to have that conversation. And if you find out that you're in a church that's fairly united in having a more traditional understanding, and it makes you uncomfortable to be part of a denomination that does not, there are potential ways for you to disaffiliate. But the first step is really to sound out the other members of the congregation and see where people stand. Because even if you try to disaffiliate, you're going to need a 2/3 vote. So you've got to be pretty united as a congregation in order to move forward. Then if you have that unity and you're desiring to look at the possibility of disaffiliation, then you can contact your district superintendent and say you're interested in knowing, is there a way for your church to consider disaffiliation? And it will vary from one annual conference to another. Some annual conferences are going to say yes, as you alluded to. Bishop Beard and others are saying yes, there will be a way. Other annual conferences will say, no, disaffiliation expired at the end of 2023. We're not going to consider any more disaffiliations. So you are at the mercy of the annual conference leaders. But where there is an annual conference that's willing to work with you, you could negotiate a way out for your congregation and potentially have that be successful. I think
Go
if
ahead.
you're not in an annual conference that is willing to consider disaffiliation, your option really is to walk away. Some people are saying, well, we can always withhold apportionments, which you can do. I'm not sure that that's going to accomplish a whole lot. Eventually, the conference is going to appoint a pastor to your church, one that you may not want. And what do you do then? So, I'm not sure it's worth fighting against the church if they're not willing to let you go. You may just have to decide that your principles are more important than keeping the building.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's a very difficult decision for people, especially people that have worshiped all their lives in a building. People have invested so much in their buildings and in their cemeteries and things like that. And so it's very difficult. But when we're watching the disaffiliation going on in other denominations like the Episcopal Church and the Presbyterian Church, we noticed that churches who had to walk away and start over oftentimes ended up in a much better situation.
Hmm.
They really had a unity of purpose and a pioneering spirit that enabled them to restart ministry in a whole new way. They weren't saddled with an old building that was not really fit for the kinds of ministry that they wanted to do. Um, and they didn't have all these repair bills that they had to do and maintenance of a building. And so they were free to explore different possibilities of ministry and really go in a different direction. And so a lot of stories have come out about churches that have walked away from their building as a congregation and started over and forming a new congregation without a building at first, and then eventually finding a way to have that building property. So um, it's not a end of the world if you have to walk away.
Yeah, it feels like it is, but it's really not. And indeed, as you said, it can go in a lot of good directions. I was interviewed by a guy in the course of our conversation. I said, if you're happy in your United Methodist congregation and your denomination, if you're not at all bothered by the changes being made, do not disaffiliate. Do not leave. Please do not come to the Global Methodist Church. We don't want you. Stay in the United Methodist Church. Bless the United Methodist Church. Be at peace in the United Methodist Church. He was kind of surprised to hear me say that. I think a lot of people are of the mind that conservatives like me want everybody to leave the UMC and it'll just be childless and poor. That's not what I want. I suspect you're in the same place as me, that if somebody has a happy home in the UMC, by all means, please stay. Your concern is just with those who would not be happy with the current direction and need to have the conversation. Have I read you correctly, Tom?
Well, absolutely. We just want people to be where they can be most fruitful for the kingdom of God.
Mm.
And if they can be fruitful in the United Methodist Church, they should stay. And so, it's not like we're out trying to poach congregations.
Yeah.
It's more a matter of empowering congregations to have the information they need to make wise decisions that are fit for them. What I'm
That sounds
afraid of is that there are a lot of congregations where they may not have a majority, but a substantial minority of people are not going to be able to remain United Methodist because of the changes that are taking place and the direction the church is going. And as a result, they will end up leaving their congregation and finding another church,
Mhm.
which will end up weakening a lot of congregations. And that will be a difficult and tragic situation as well.
Yeah, it seems almost inevitable that there's a lot more fallout and sadness coming. But for my part, I'm praying that churches can get where they need to go, and that there can be a realignment that actually results in some significant gains. The United Methodist Church hasn't known any gains really since it was formed in 1968. And it sure would be good to have a different chapter where the church in America is successfully beating back the gates of hell. So to that end, I'm really appreciative of you and Good News. Y'all did a really good video series a couple of years ago. Of course, Rob was the guy on camera, but that really helped a lot of congregations navigate the issues at play, how to move forward, and that was a great resource. You have provided excellent resources all along the way, Tom, with very thoughtful and mature and discerning articles. And so I just want to thank you for that, and I want to ask you how it is that people need to know how to follow you, because you're not done working for them and equipping the church. So where can they go to follow you and what you're doing, and how can they stay informed?
Well, Good News publishes a weekly email newsletter that we send out to people called Perspective. And you can sign up to get that on our website, which is goodnewsmag.org. And so we would encourage people to do that. That's the primary way of getting connected with us. Obviously, we welcome donations that help our ministry to continue. And we send out a magazine 6 times a year that really captures the kinds of record of what's going on in the church and where the future lies as well. So we have the print magazine, we have our website that's available to everybody, and then our weekly email newsletter that I would encourage people to follow.
Yeah, on the interview with Rob yesterday, he said the long-term plan was not to have Good News open indefinitely, and I think maybe I would have let people come away from that conversation thinking that Good News is already closing up shop, but you're not. So I think it would be really good for people to go over to goodnewsmag.org, make sure that you're on their lists and that you're staying apprised of what they're doing and that you support them until the day comes when they're done and they are trusting that the Lord is pleased. And to that end, Tom, may God continue to bless the work of your hands and give you much fruitfulness in what you do. I said it at the outset, and I can't say it enough how much of a benefit you personally have been to me and professionally. And I'm just so grateful that God raised you up and that you've been able to serve in the capacity that you have. I think we've had some other good folks, and I don't want to at all disparage them, but without you, I think we would have been much poorer. And so thank you for the years you've given to this project, Tom.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. It's been an honor to serve and continues to be an honor to serve the Lord in this way. And I feel called to it. And not everybody does, but this is the kind of ministry that God's called me to in this season of my life. And I'm pleased to be able to do it. And I do not do it alone. We have a great team of people here at Good News, as well as in the broader evangelical community. And we work together and we support each other and reinforce each other. So there's a lot of teamwork that goes behind this process.
That shows, yeah. Friends, this has been Tom Lambrecht. If this has been your first time with him, then you're welcome. I'm very happy to have provided this for you. And if you're grateful, then make sure to show that by liking the video and subscribing. And I'm particularly interested in comments and reflections on this and all the wonderful myriad ways that I have failed. Go ahead and let me know in the comments. But we need to call this conversation to a close. So may God bless you. I would ask you when the video ends to pray for Tom and his ministry and pray for the United Methodist Church and all of the churches that are coming out of that God would work something pleasing in his sight out of all this tragedy. So that'll conclude our time today. God bless you. I'll see you later, friends.